Welcome back to the Magnolia Media Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan M. Ruggiero. Well, the wait is over. We finally know that the vice presidential candidate running alongside current Vice President Kamala Harris will be Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, which was a bit of a surprise, at least to me, especially since this particular campaign stop and announcement and celebration was to be held in Philadelphia. But more on why it was held in Philadelphia and why she is blanketing the state of Pennsylvania a little later in this podcast. Now, if you don't know Tim Walz at all, spelled W-A-L-Z, not W-A-L-T-Z. It's not Waltz. It's Walz. He's the governor of Minnesota. He won and held a congressional seat in the state of Minnesota that has only elected one Democrat since the year 1892. So it's as red a district as you can find in the state of Minnesota. Yet, even in 2016, even after being one of the House members who voted to pass the Affordable Care Act, which he owned, which he talked about on the stump on a regular basis, on top of having been a sergeant major as a general enlistee in the United States Army Reserves at the age of 17, having won the Congressional Marksman Award when he served in the United States Congress. A man who once had an A rating from the NRA, but after the Parkland school shooting, gave every penny he had ever received from the NRA in the form of campaign contributions to the nonprofit fighting gun violence that arose, that came from that Parkland shooting, and came, of course, from the Sandy Hook shooting. A sincere man, a former educator, a former soldier, a former congressman, and the current governor of Minnesota. But more on him tomorrow. Today, we're going to dig in just a little bit into the numbers, into where we are at this current moment in the 2024 election. One more note on Governor Walz. He is also the man who labeled MAGA Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance, if that's his real name. After all, he has changed it 3 times legally. It's not just like an artist who's decided to go by a different name, like LL Cool J. No, this is a man who has literally run from his own name on at least 2 occasions since he's had 3 different legal names. We know J.D. Vance is not his real name, certainly not the one on his birth certificate. After all, it is Republicans who are obsessed with people's birth certificates. But back to Governor Walz for a moment. He is the man who successfully labeled Republicans in the MAGA movement, Trump and J.D. Vance, as just plain weird. A moniker that has stuck with them since he labeled them weird. Because on top of being crazy and dangerous and wishing they could take this country back to a time of robber barons and the 19-teens or the 1890s, long before women had the right to vote, long before black folks had any real access to the polls. We will not go back. That has become the moniker of the Harris campaign, now the Harris-Walz campaign. Today I did watch his speech this evening just before recording. And again, we will cover it in depth tomorrow. We've discussed the three former names here. We've discussed J.D. Vance having been formerly gay until going away on a Catholic retreat. This is something I wish the news, especially liberal media, would cover a little more in depth, because someone needs to tell the eyeliner wearing J.D. Vance, who apparently hates childless people, especially childless women. That's not how gay works. You either are or you aren't. And it seems to me that as he was coming into the time in life where one finds their sexual maturity, where one finds their sexual identity, he identified as a gay man. Nothing wrong with that. Where the problem begins is when you denounce who you are personally, and from then on seem uncomfortable in your own skin, even after, well, reportedly having children with his current wife. Who really knows? We do know that they're after IVF, but perhaps not before J.D. Vance's wife could get pregnant. Anyway, J.D. Vance has suggested... Of course, it's J.D. Vance who believes that we single people with no children should pay more in taxes because we don't have an appropriate shared stake in America's future. Don't believe it should work that way, JD. In fact, we're less of a drain on the system. Now, this is no knock on anyone with children, but if we're going to talk nasty, if we're going to be realistic about it, it's those of us who haven't increased the population of the United States, who haven't felt we need to leave some legacy behind, or that we need children to validate our existence. Because we really know he's talking about women. Women at home, barefoot, in the kitchen, and pregnant. That's J.D. Vance's vision for the future. We all know the fraud that is convicted felon Donald Trump has no vision for America. He has no vision for the future. But as we learned in 2016, we can't underestimate his insanity. One important note before we start diving into the numbers, and more bad news for Trump, as this polling that they said was just a sugar high and would just pass, keeps looking like a trend, as Kamala Harris has completely done away with Donald Trump's lead over Joe Biden. Keep this in mind. In the year 2024, Joe Biden never led in the poll of polls on 538 over Donald Trump. He had never led. He had been down by as many as 3 points in their national average of polls. Now, I'm not a big fan of polls, but what they can show you is a trend. And this trend appears to be real, especially if you're watching these rallies on TV. Now, for those of you who might be sympathetic to the MAGA cause and believe the hype that, hundreds of thousands of people turn out to see Trump, like in New Jersey when 100,000 people supposedly jammed into an area where only 10,000 people could fit, and even those people were trying to flee. Now they're having to block the exits to stop people from fleeing because the rambling madman with dementia, who is Dementia J, convicted felon Donald Trump, is rambling on for 90, sometimes 120 consecutive minutes about everything from Hannibal Lecter, his good friend. Hannibal Lecter, of course, the fictional character from the film Silence of the Lambs. And when he says it, Silence of the Lambs, to his, quote, relationship with MIT, because I'm very smart, you know. You really have to read the written copies. The stenographer. Get those copies of his speeches and read them aloud. It's insanity. But don't worry about old Donald, because, you know, all of these celebrities coming out in support of Kamala Harris, just to name a few. Let's see. Oh, right off the rip, Megan Thee Stallion and Quad. Okay. Jamie Lee Curtis, Spike Lee, Shonda Rhimes, Rosie O'Donnell, a familiar name on the left, especially the very liberal, very, very liberal left. Let's see. Aaron Sorkin, who, according to Keith Olbermann, never had an original thought in his life. And I have to give Keith credit for that because it's in his stories he promised not to tell, the Aaron Sorkin saga, or sagas he has gone through over the last 20 years or so, including the incredibly good television show, practically based on Keith Olbermann's life, or at least his time at MSNBC, starring Jeff Daniels, which was a fantastic show. I believe it was called Newsroom. But on with the list of celebrity endorsements. Wanda Sykes, legendary comic. Kerry Washington, who, again, according to Keith Olbermann, carried on a relationship with Lawrence O'Donnell. Yes, MSNBC fans, that Lawrence O'Donnell. I guess it really does prove there really are no leagues when it comes to dating if you have the audacity to try. Let's see, where to go next? Ariana Grande. This type of endorsement, Ariana Grande, Megan Thee Stallion, these are people who are turning out young voters. They have young voter enthusiasm through the roof. In fact, it's beginning to feel a little bit like 2008. On a cellular level, it's beginning to feel a little bit like the Obama coalition. You see, I was 24 in 2008, so I would have been what Gen Z, or whatever they call it nowadays, is today. I was one of those young people. I had to wait till age 24 to try to complete my college education, and any of you who followed me here have heard that story before, because back then the financial aid department had a 24-year exemption if you were going to file without your parents' tax returns. But let's go back to the list. Barbra Streisand. Well, Barbra Streisand certainly can't hurt, can she? Nor can George Clooney, or Olivia Rodrigo, or Busy Phillips, or the great George Takei. And that's, of course, just to name a few. There will be plenty more. But oh, MAGA world, don't worry. Trump, he has plenty of celebrity endorsements too. Plenty of them. Oh, really plenty. Like Kevin Sorbo. That's right. If you're not at least 40 and at some point watched the very cheaply produced, I believe it was the Hercules series that came on right around the time of Xena Warrior Princess on the cheapest television network that made it onto mainstream television back then. He's that guy, if you can kind of remember him. An actor who hasn't worked in 30 years. How is Kevin Sorbo even being brought up? But congratulations to getting a celebrity endorsement from a celebrity who isn't really a celebrity anymore. His celebrity has long since passed. Then there's Scott Baio. Remember Scott Baio? Another blast from the past. A TV star who hasn't had a show on since Charles in Charge, and that was on when I was preschool age, 3, 4, 5 years old, in the mid-'80s through, the early 90s. That was the last of Scott Baio. Now, according to Scott Baio, he has all of this money coming in from residuals. And he had, of course, his reality TV show. And the reality TV crew, well, they've got to stick together, don't they? Because we had a reality TV president for 4 years before Joe Biden and the American people threw him out. And then, of course, there's Kid Rock. I think Crystal Rock would probably fit a little better. Anyway, back to maybe Terry Bollea. Most people wouldn't recognize the name Terry Bollea because for the last 45 years he has spent his life pretending to be someone else. Hulk Hogan. I mean, even the WWE didn't want him anymore. And perhaps even the spokesperson for booze, Ambien, and, of course, racism, Roseanne Barr. Yes, that Roseanne. You know, the Roseanne who likes to get all loaded on Ambien sleeping pills and booze and then tweet extremely racist and derogatory things to leaders in this country because apparently America hasn't been fair enough to Roseanne. I mean, after all, she was born looking that way. There's not much she could do about that. But otherwise, we're talking about one of the few actors out there, probably the 0.1%, who's actually made a ton of money in her life. It's been quite insightful seeing all the interviews that have popped up with her ex-husband, Tom Arnold. Tom Arnold, yet another celebrity who I'm sure would endorse Kamala Harris if his endorsement really mattered. But again, this seems like a version of the 2008 Obama coalition. Only, again, this time the millennials aren't the young people. We see young people running back to the Democratic Party. Among young people, voters under the age of 30, Kamala Harris has a 24% lead over Donald Trump. Or one should say she does 24% better than Trump among these people. And these aren't the only numbers that hurt if you're, well, Trump and the rest of MAGA, as the polling thing, like I said, has really turned into a trend. And for political junkies like myself, and likely you, if you're sitting around listening to a political podcast like this one, they're something we sort of love to hate. Because polls can be quite misleading. They're not shooting for who wins or who loses as much as they're shooting for a margin of error. And again, who actually answers their telephone for numbers they don't recognize? I know that I certainly don't. So, let's jump into those polls. Let's begin with 538's poll of polls. Harris, 45.1, Trump, 43.4, and Kennedy, 5.4%. And I'm guessing that poll of poll was done before the dead bear cub story, really a sickening story, that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. told himself. He himself told this incredibly lie-filled story, of which, I believe it was the New Yorker, has photographs of RFK Jr. dumping the dead bear in Central Park and then planting a bicycle nearby as if a bear cub could be killed by a bicycle. The bicyclist might have gotten killed, but anyway, back to the numbers. Survey USA, Harris 48, Trump 45. The Morning Consult, Harris 48, Trump 44. TIPP Insights, Harris 44, Trump 42, Kennedy 7, again before the bear incident, West 1%, Stein 1%. Actually, they're polling below 1%, but they round it to 1%. Today, this from Newsweek, Trump fails to top Harris in Republican Again, Republican-funded poll. Even the Republicans can't manipulate a poll that shows anything more than a tie, giving each of them 45-45, with Kennedy, West, and Stein included. Head-to-head, they're 48-48. Remind me of a GOP failed poll, couldn't find or misrepresent enough Pennsylvania voters. 538's poll of polls has Harris ahead in PA, 45.3 to 44.5. This, despite the narrative that Trump has some sort of a stranglehold on the state of Pennsylvania. He does not. More from Forbes. 80% of Democrats say they are happy with with Kamala Harris atop the ticket, while only 48% said the same about President Biden. This was not a reflection of President Biden personally. Again, this was the constant bashing of his age. It didn't help the New York Times and my favorite punching bag, Peter Baker, the nerdy little worm who MSNBC would do well to dump, writing a hit piece because he wouldn't sit down, and now definitely won't sit down for a full interview with the god of media, a newspaper, the New York Times, which used to be really important. More polls. Michigan, Harris, average of plus 1.6 over Trump. Wisconsin, Harris, with an average of plus 1.4 over Trump. Nevada, Harris is up 2%. That's from The Hill, not from Newsweek, which reminded us of a recent Morning Consult poll, which shows the vice president up 11 percentage points in Michigan. This might be a little bit of an outlier, but I wouldn't count on it, as Michigan has become perhaps the most liberal of the Rust Belt states, even surpassing Pennsylvania, which of course has the monstrous city of Philadelphia, and the sort of smaller city off to the west in Pittsburgh. Both of them beautiful cities, especially Pittsburgh, which will likely be the home of this podcast in the years to come, as I will likely be moving there, and as I am the founder of the podcast, it will likely move with me. Although our roots will always be right here in Scruffy City, in Knoxville, Tennessee. And of course, we're known as the City of Scruff, or Scruffy City, USA. There will always be love in my heart for it. And again, it's a Southerner who grew up on the farm, who used to go hunting with his grandfather, who is a firm believer in liberal values, believes in common sense gun reform, believes what 75 or 80% of the country believes, that for the most part we should just be left the hell alone. But we can't have certain things in our society that cause mass chaos and death, like allowing AR-15s to be sold to 18-year-olds who are deeply depressed or deeply dysfunctional, or do something like hide on top of an outbuilding in Butler, Pennsylvania, and take a shot at a former president of the United States, no matter what a buffoon he might be. That type of a behavior is never acceptable. Never. But again, they are the ones who have been ginning up all of this intolerance, all of this hatred for one side or the other, that they're inhuman. Remember that, Donald? Remember poisoning the blood of our country? Remember that, Donald? Remembering that if the First Amendment doesn't work, then that's why they have the Second Amendment when speaking about Hillary Clinton in 2016. Remember that, Donald? Do you remember that, MAGA fans? No, of course you don't, because you have dropped off the map. You're nowhere to be found anymore. All of your sense is gone. I mean, I know some of these MAGA people. Some of them were really good people. And then it was as if they were given a permit to just be as nasty as they want to be as underhanded and spiteful and callous and prickly. So prickly you can't get around them. You can't be around them. There are others who might have voted for him once, realized he was a buffoon, and then immediately reverted to Joe Biden. And this year have no intent of voting for him again. So it'll be a vote for Kamala Harris or no vote at the top of the ticket at all. Although we would like to have them in our big tent. We need some conservative ideas. We need to have healthy debate and compromise. We can't just have one side completely run away with everything, but that doesn't mean that we can elect any of these Republicans from our own representative here in Knoxville, Tennessee, Tim, my daddy, Burchett, with his put-on accent. I mean, this guy, what a dope. If you're not paying attention, you're not from Tennessee or not from Knoxville, please pay attention to perhaps the newest member of the MAGA caucus, Tim, my daddy, Burchett, who represents Knoxville, Tennessee. If I'm not mistaken, it's our 8th congressional district. But again, I'm not completely sure on that. Now, let's move on to some of the really difficult states. Nevada, Harris up 2%, according to The Hill, which reminded us of a recent Morning Consult poll that I mentioned a moment ago, with Kamala Harris being up 11 percentage points in Michigan. The fact she's been able to turn the table so quickly and even have an outlier poll that I've mentioned twice now about the 11% in Michigan, when she's probably really up 4 or 5. But again, Michigan had completely flipped its state house from Republican to Democrat for the first time in a long time. They have a Democratic governor. The entire state is run by the Democratic Party, and Michiganders seem to be seeing the positive benefits of it. And again, it's Detroit, it's Lansing, it's Ann Arbor. It's just a handful of places the Democrats have to win because rural America is, well, rural, which indicates there aren't many people there. That's one of the issues with Pennsylvania. Other than Harrisburg, Erie, obviously Pittsburgh and Philly, and then, of course, State College. Those are the only places Democrats have to do well. Does that mean Democrats don't care about rural America? Well, they have no incentive to care, and if it were Republicans, they certainly don't care about big blue cities in the United States. In fact, they try to use them as punching bags as often as possible. During that National Association of Black Journalists conference, that's what Trump tried to do. He tried to turn his racist trope into an attack on the groups that protested in cities like Minneapolis, in cities like Seattle, in cities like Portland, where they had every right to a peaceful protest. Unlike his supporters, who are terrorists, that showed up on January 6, 2021 and debased America, embarrassed and humiliated the rest of the population of the United States. As we watched in horror as thousands of them attacked the Capitol as if they were ants swarming over a drop of honey. And 150 or so police officers were overwhelmed in hand-to-hand combat that lasted more than 3 hours while Trump sat and watched it on television because he's a psychopath. He is completely unhinged. He has no feeling for anything except his own survival. And he knows this. He knows this because the people around him have surely warned him that if he is not elected president of the United States, he will in fact die in prison. It's just that simple. At some point, Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito will be run off the Supreme Court. At some point, the Supreme Court will be expanded to, 15 or maybe 21 seats. When that happens, what do you think happens to, these Supreme Court justices who are going to watch their life's work of undermining the United States Constitution come to an abrupt halt, as they wish to just, issue rulings. They don't even want to wait for appropriate cases to come before them. They want to be both legislators, presidents, kings, authoritarians, and tell the rest of us, the majority, how the minority lives, that we should live like the minority, that we should be like that minority, that we should all believe in their God, that we should all worship in their churches, that we should all take their hard right anti-Christian position on just about everything, because none of it is Christ-like. I mean, holy Christ. Anyway, Arizona, one of the states where Harris is up within the margin of error by about 1 point in Arizona. That even by Redfield and Wilton. Redfield and Wilton, of course, a hard right-wing pollster of their own. The most recent Morning Consult poll has the current vice president up 4 in Arizona. Again, Arizona is becoming a blue state. At the moment, it's a purple state. I'll give you that. But when you're running Senate candidates who just won't get out of the way, like Kari Lake, and an endorsement from Donald Trump is all you need to lock down a primary victory in a Republican primary, just to go on and lose, as Kari Lake did to Governor Hobbs when she ran for governor of Arizona 2 years ago. This woman can't stop losing. Yet all we hear is win, 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 win. Fight, 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 fight. And of course you can get your fight, fight, fight tennis shoes, your assassination edition gold tennis shoes for anywhere from $299 to $400 on one of Trump's websites. If you want to waste some money on garbage that looks like it would fall apart almost immediately. Now, we move into Georgia, where Democrats were all giving up under the Biden ticket. When Biden was atop the ticket, he was down 7-8 points in Georgia. But now Trump's lead has eroded to 1 percentage point. 1 percentage point over Harris and 538's poll of polls. And of course, that's only going back about 3 weeks, because they were still polling Joe Biden as the Democratic candidate because, well, he had the delegates at the time. So it makes some sense, even though it had been announced he would be stepping aside after this term ends on January 20th, 2025. We just have to make damn sure that Donald Trump continues to drag the Republican Party into the ever darker abyss. And speaking of dark abyss, the state of Florida is now in play. The state of Florida, the most corrupt state in America, a state that's known for swamps, amusement parks, oppressive heat, hate rallies, white supremacy, throwing out 1 in every 10 black votes from Miami-Dade County back in the year 2000 to ensure Al Gore would lose and therefore lose the 2000 election, which led to almost a Great Depression, at least a Great Recession, and that's how it's known in the history books, which led to 2 forever wars, one which made no sense at all, Iraq, completely destabilized the Middle East, and this whole nation-building nonsense that was fed to us by the Bush administration at the time. And I feel that Bush is getting too much of a pass for being, well, a nice guy in person. Well, this nice guy turned the running of our country over to a madman. A madman completely consumed with how much money, that's right, how much money Halliburton could make. Halliburton Drive, right down the middle of Baghdad. Onward Onward and upward. I don't think Walz hurts at all when it comes to a state like Texas or a state like Florida, especially considering we know he can have a moderate position. However, he was also the first governor in the United States after the fall of Roe v. Wade to sign into law protections for women in the state of Minnesota. Now, of course, many blue states have gone on to do the same thing, but the fact is, Walz was first to take that step to protect women from this Supreme Court, which of course is going after contraception and IVF next. Another factor about Tim Walz, and again, we'll talk more and we'll talk in depth about him tomorrow. Tim Walz had to use IVF in order to have his daughter, Hope. IVF, a process that Republicans hope to ban because somehow those eggs are human beings. Maybe they should pay taxes, JD. I mean, they're not doing anything except running up electric bills at, IVF clinics where they have to be held at a certain temperature, where I'm sure the electric bills are eye-popping. Maybe they should, those embryos, whoever froze those embryos, if they vote Republican, maybe they should have to pay 10% more in taxes, completely bankrupting an America that already has the largest gap between rich and the working class, the middle class, that we've ever seen. Something that has to stop. And yes, we saw Linda Yaccarino's disgusting and tired trope on X today as she went on and announced a series of lawsuits against, advertisers and other organizations that say they've targeted X. Yes, because it's a cesspool. Because everything that goes on there anymore is pro-Nazi or pro-right-wing conspiracy theory, or about how much Elon hates the liberal America, the free America, the part of America that wants to just leave everybody alone and treat each other with mutual respect. That's all liberal America wants. That, and for the government to make sure people don't fall through the cracks. An America where rent is actually affordable based on what people make. And if we can't improve rent, then we have to improve wages. And that's, I'm sorry for that small business owner who can't actually afford to be in business because they're paying somebody $8 an hour. All of these positions are so incredibly popular. I mean, we have 75-80% consensus on common sense gun laws. We have almost 70% consensus in this country on the legalization of abortion, of women's health care. Who knows what the polling would be on contraception, on like the sale of condoms to stop the spread of things like, AIDS. Seems like a good idea, doesn't it? At least it was the idea preached to us in Red State, Tennessee growing up. Be sure and use a condom anytime you're having sex with someone who is not your permanent partner, or if you're not trying to get pregnant. Now, let's talk for a moment about perhaps why Shapiro, who gave one heck of a fierce speech prior to the introduction of Vice President Kamala Harris and her pick for Vice President, Tim Walz, in Philadelphia today, and that is Governor Josh Shapiro. Perhaps his comments on Palestine going back 30 years, it just creates some fodder for the right. It creates some fodder for the far left part of the party, who is, to be frank, completely with the Palestinians and want a ceasefire in Gaza. Despite the fact the war seems to be widening and it seems to be happening because Benjamin Netanyahu wants to. Well, Benjamin Netanyahu should do what Russia's doing and read the tea leaves. Things are not going well for the Trump fascist overhaul of America. Because he has to get elected, and the system is still in place because we have a president with a real moral compass who actually gives a damn about the United States, who's been a public servant for 50 years. Trump wouldn't understand anything about public service because, well, the only person he's ever serviced is himself and perhaps some prostitutes. But we'll leave that aside. Again, that's a topic for another day. On to the last page as we wrap things up today. The ultimate point in spouting out all of those numbers and going through all of the different polls is that there is a trend. Whether they are right-leaning polls or left-leaning polls or mainstream polls, whether it's Nate Silver's 538, whether it's The Hill, whether it's Forbes, whether it's Bloomberg, whomever is doing the polling, the outcome is essentially the same. Trump's lead has been erased in just 3 weeks. Not to mention, in 2 weeks, Kamala Harris raised $310 million for her campaign. And a full 4-week period, that makes up 1 month, the month of July, the Trump campaign drug in $139 million. That's more money for ads. That's more money for door knockers. That's more money for more campaign offices because, well, Trump's ground game is frankly anemic. It's impotent. And he might know something about impotency. Nevertheless, back to the point. We have to get out. We have to vote. We have to support our democracy. Even Republicans, you conservatives who believe in democracy, there is a such thing as a pro-democracy conservative. Yesterday's New York Times Daily podcast featured a young trans person who graduated Yale Law with J.D. Vance and knew him quite well before he did his about face, his 180-degree turn from what he was, sort of a sympathetic conservative, to an extremist who's made these comments about childless cat ladies alienating, 52% of America's electorate. Now, that doesn't mean that every woman in America is going to vote for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. No, in fact, a sizable portion of them will still vote for Donald Trump because they have Roseanne Barr syndrome. They've been done unfairly. They want to lash out. They want to have the permission that Trump grants them to be nasty, to swallow every conspiracy theory that comes along, hook, line, and sinker. And well, I think I will leave it at that for today's podcast. Again, my name is Jonathan M. Ruggiero. You have been listening to the Magnolia Media Podcast, brought to you by the Magnolia Media Network. If you enjoyed the podcast here today, if you enjoyed our work in the past, please consider giving at patreon.com/Magnolia Media Network. It's $5. $5. Less than half of what you'd spend on a coffee from Starbucks. And when we get to 500 people, I'll start posting a walled-off newsletter just for you special folks who've helped keep us on the air. Also, check out my Instagram, which is completely dedicated to the Magnolia Media Podcast at MagnoliaJohn2024. That's also the same on Threads. I assume there's a Facebook page out there somewhere that's very similar to that, although I don't follow Facebook at all. I do work with Meta, again, through Instagram. But I sort of stay away from the rest. You can also find me at Magnolia John 2. Again, Magnolia John 2 on Twitter or X or whatever the hell that cesspool is called these days. But until next time, from us here at the Magnolia Media Podcast, be well, won't you?